So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a late morning. My name is Harald Oberhofer, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this edition of FIW-Trade Talks. The FIW-Trade Talks is an online series, which you can obviously see, in which we discuss current trade policy topics with renewed experts in the field. The talks are financially supported by the Austrian Federal Ministry of Digital and Economic Affairs, and we are very grateful for this financial support. Before moving on with today's talk, just a few remarks regarding the setup of this talk. So we're going to start with a 15 to 20 minutes input of our today's expert, and this will be followed by about a 45 minutes discussion between myself and my renowned guest today. And you can also participate in the discussion by just using the Q&A section, the Q&A button in Zoom. So please just post your questions or comments there. I will have an eye on them and will bring your questions to our guest. With this, I would like to move on with today's topic. Today, we're going to talk about trade restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I could not think about a more renowned expert on this topic as our today's guest. Our today's guest is Simon J. Evenett, who is professor for international economics and development at the University of St. Gallen. He's also founder of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade. He's co-director of the CPR program in international trade and regional economics. He held a lot of different positions. He also participated in many policy commissions over the last years. He holds a PhD from Yale University, and during the COVID pandemic, he was among those researchers that very quickly came up with a lot of important research. For example, with a book co-edited by himself and Richard Baldwin on COVID-19 and the economics of COVID-19. And I'm very much looking forward to your input, Simon. Thank you very much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Harold, for this invitation, and also to be able to speak to the audience here today. I'm really looking forward to the questions and answers which will come later. Now, as you said, I'm going to try and provide some overview of the trade policy restrictions and actions taken during the pandemic era, in particular in the area of medical goods, which is very sensitive. And I'm happy to talk about the developments in the areas of food and in vaccines as well, should you wish. But in order to provide this information, I need to explain how we secure this information through the Global Trade Alert Initiative. And what I'll do, if you don't mind, is explain why transparency is very important, how we go about trying to make the trading system transparent, and then what results we've found as a result of looking, especially in this area. So let me share some slides with the colleagues and then try and take this discussion forward. So the starting point is that in many economies, it's accepted that transparency is a foundation of good national and international economic governance. We have statements by a US Supreme Court justice, the famous Justice Brandeis, arguing that sunlight is the best form of disinfectant. We also have Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a very accomplished Harvard professor who became a United States Senator, who said the following: everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And I think this is a statement which I really like, because often in trade policy discussions, even the facts are contested, or worse, actually, the trade policy discussions take place in the absence of any facts. And my view is that we can do better than this, and that we need to do better from this if we're going to build trust between governments, which will support more trade cooperation. Now, the problem is if you match that need for transparency with the reality of transparency on the ground in the trading system, you see a huge mismatch. And the problem is not the international organizations, the problem is governments. Many governments are particularly bad at notifying the WTO of their actions on time. Some G20 countries have deliberately starved the WTO staff of information on trade policies, especially in the area of subsidies. No international organization has been given a mandate to systematically collect information on non-tariff barriers. UNCTAD has done some good work here, but it needs to go much further. And likewise on subsidies, we have international organizations which have done really good jobs in certain areas of subsidies. The OECD has done good work on fossil fuel subsidies, so is the IMF, for example. But we have no across-the-board mandate to collect information on subsidies as well. And those subsidies, of course, can distort trade flows. So when you put this all together, we have essentially a woeful state of transparency about the trading system. And these outcomes are not an accident. They were there by design. Governments did not want the scrutiny. And the unfortunate consequence of this is that it's possible for trade disputes to build up where there's a very unclear underlying factual basis, and this is unhelpful and the last thing the world needs at a time like this. When it comes to collecting information about what governments are doing, and this is exactly what the Global Trade Alert Initiative has been doing since November 2008, we have noticed a number of problems which further complicate matters. Here is a great example. On the left-hand side is a 2020 tariff increase by India, and it is written in the most obtuse language. And I defy most, even PhD trained economists, to be able to read, to understand what is actually being written here. You need experts to be able to do this, and we have experts on our team who do this. On the right-hand side, we have the English language version of this statement, this bureaucratese, which we've published on our website. So some governments make it very hard even to track what they're doing. The second problem is that many international organizations, when they do collect information in a poorly structured way, which is not very useful for tracking down what governments are doing, and certainly not useful for researchers either. So the available information is often a mess. So even when the information is available, it's not presented in a way which is usable. And our goal has always been to say that we can do so much better than this. And we have. The consequences, just so we're clear of what all this information vacuum is generating, are listed here. The first is the public is denied information to hold governments accountable. And I'm afraid the media these days is under such financial pressure, especially traditional media, that they do not have the resources to be able to do this. And as a result, accountability is diminished. Our democracies suffer as a result. The second thing, as we saw all too well in the last US administration, is that politicians make false claims about foreign governments, which are hard to counter because of a lack of reliable information. And this just exacerbates trade tensions, which is bad news. And the third thing is that there are strong incentives for certain interest groups to hoard information. And this helps, unfortunately, discredit globalization. And I see globalization as a massive opportunity for companies, for individuals to live better lives. So transparency is very bad negative consequences. Now, what I want to describe is how we have tried to fix this problem, and fix it we have collected over the last 12 years information on over 40,000 different public policy interventions. The comparable data set by the World Trade Organization is about a quarter of the size. So you get a sense about the mismatch in information available. Our information is all publicly available. It can be sorted, searched, and alike. And so in this sense, we are trying to do our bit to make the trading system more transparent and to get discussions between governments on an evidence-driven basis. How do we work? Well, we source information on what governments are doing, largely off government websites. We systematically track them. We document and tag information on public policy changes which are likely to affect international business. We review them using 7 tests, and only if 7 tests are met is data included in our website or information included. So there's a very serious filtering process and review process, and we use the data and we update the data as new information comes forward. So we have a very rigorous methodology which has been applied for 12 years. The types of information we report are which country is taking the action, which level of government, what policy intervention, which firms are eligible for the support, dates as to when things come into effect. Very useful for policymakers and for analysts, which products are affected, which HS codes are affected, which sectors are affected. And lastly, the critical thing, what's our assessment about whether the policy intervention favors local firms or foreign firms? Does it alter the relative treatment of them? And with information on the HS codes and the sector codes, we can identify which foreign trading partners are affected. So in this way, this is how we have created this large searchable data set. The data is used for a number of reasons, number of ways, for analysis and policy recommendations. Some people like to extract our data and manipulate it themselves, presenting information. And obviously, people use our database to search what's really going on, not what governments are saying is going on. So these are the big uses of our data that we see. Now, let's turn to the pandemic, and so we can get to the subject of today's session. One of the things we started doing at the beginning of the pandemic was tracking how government policies, especially trade policies, were changing towards medical goods and towards food. Now, we included food as well in our tracking because you may remember at the global financial crisis, there was a huge resort to export controls for food back in 2008 through to 11. And this actually led to riots and social instability in some countries. There was a fear that this would happen again this time around. Fortunately, it's not happened, but as you know, at the moment, food prices are surging. And so we may go into a phase where this becomes a problem. What is on this slide is it has nothing to do with the food sector. It has to do with the medical goods sector, which was the other big sector we tracked. So here we're thinking about medical equipment, medical kit. Also, over time, we included information on vaccines ingredients too. And what this shows you week by week is the number of different types of policy interventions which were in force. So let's start with the dark blue line, and we start in this initiative. The world starts on the 1st of January 2020. So let's start there. Everything is compared to that benchmark. You can see as we get into April, over 200 different interventions were introduced, which liberalized medical goods trade. And this was very sensible. So we found at the beginning of the pandemic, dozens of countries were taxing imported soap, taxing imported disinfectant. And many governments took one look at these policies and said, this is nuts. At the very time we need all this health supporting medical items, we should be abolishing our tariffs. And that's exactly what many governments have done. And by and large, we've had 200 such reforms, import reforms stay in place ever since. That's the dark blue line. The light brown line, which is the second from the top, is the one which got all the media attention, however. And this is the resort to export controls, export bans, which were put on medical equipment. And you can see that they surged up to about 140 interventions in the early part of the second quarter of last year. And then the numbers fell off a little bit towards the end of last year, but are creeping back up again over time, which is very worrying. Now, you may remember that these export bans on face masks, personal protective equipment, and on the components necessary to produce things like respirators, which was so essential last year. These disrupted supply chains. They were extremely provocative measures. And even within the European Union, there were problems. The single market temporarily fractured. And it took some very, I think, forceful action by the European Commission to assert control over this and to restore the integrity of the single market, which by and large has happened. So we can see that this was a set of measures which were taken. Now, in terms of the governments taking these measures, many of the largest trading nations put in place these measures, but some did not. It's important to acknowledge Canada did not put in place any of these export controls, nor did Japan, and nor did Australia for goods which were manufactured in Australia. So if you bought or sourced masks from Australia, they were not banned. The exports of them were not banned. So we have G20 members who refrained from using export controls. So if anyone says, oh, everyone has to engage in export controls during the politics of this is obvious, that I would contest that actually. Some countries were able to manage an effective pandemic response without disrupting supplies of export of medical goods to other countries. And I think those countries which refrained from using export controls in this manner will probably be rewarded over the medium to longer term, as they have established reputations as being reliable suppliers at a time of crisis. You can also see in this chart something which is very puzzling. During a pandemic, we seem to have some governments, and this is the light blue line, actually raising import barriers on medical goods, which is extraordinary, right? I mean, why would you start taxing or impeding the inflow of medical goods at a time of a pandemic? And this is a phenomenon which I find very hard to understand either as a public health response or as a trade policy response. So this type of very detailed work is what we have been doing, and we update these numbers every week. In fact, we're doing the update this week for our December release, and you can see that the patterns have pretty much stabilized over time, which is good and bad. The situation isn't getting any worse, but we still have quite a number of these export controls which need to be unwound. And I would hope the governments would take steps in this regard, but we will see at the WTO's ministerial conference if governments are willing to take any additional steps in this regard. So this gives you a sense of the payoff from the type of work that we do. Let me just quickly wrap up. Our mantra is to take trade policy out of the dark ages of non-transparency. Okay, the information base to guide trade policy making is very thin and it's very selective. And this is the way it is. It suits the interests of many official and commercial interests for there to be this lack of transparency. My view is that this leads to bad policy, unnecessary trade tensions, and misleading academic analyses. Okay, we can and must do better. Our prosperity in Europe, as nations which are highly integrated into the trading system, depends on transparency in part to work, and we really need to join forces to make this system more transparent and to encourage people to analyze information on trade policy, so we've got more high quality analysis to inform what governments inform policymakers and the like. So this is very much the agenda I have going forward. I have on this last slide here just some URLs which you can access in order to learn more about how the Global Trade Alert works and what we find. But please go on our database, go on our website, check it out. Check out also the Digital Policy Alert, which is our new initiative for tracking developments in the digital economy. And of course, get in touch with us if you have any questions which you would want answering. So let me stop there, Harald, and turn over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Very interesting talk and insights. I already have a couple of questions which I would like to raise. But before moving on, just a reminder to the audience, please use the Q&A section, post your questions, and we will discuss them over the next 40 minutes or so. But maybe let me start first with a very general question. So first of all, I would really like to congratulate you on the Global Trade Initiative. This is really, in my point of view, a very, very important project. I totally agree that transparency and facts are those things we really need in all policy areas, especially also including trade policy. also due to the fact that we are talking about governments that talk to each other, and here the fact should be right first to start proper discussions on how to move on different directions. So maybe to start first, I would be interested in the Global Trade Initiative. So you told that you're doing this since 2008, right? And you're coming up with a large number of data actually, and specific trade policy changes. So could you elaborate a little bit on the resources that you have available for doing this? Because I actually expect that that's a lot of work to do, right?
So yes, thank you for the question. Collecting information, processing it, and publishing it does indeed take resources, and we have a fantastic team which is based at the St. Gallen Endowment, which does this. And this team draws from trade policy experts from all over the world. So all the major jurisdictions and many of the others, we have analysts who can read the local languages, interpret trade policy events, process information. Because we are processing these days thousands of public policy interventions every year, this requires having putting in place systems and procedures which have to be complied with. And I must say the colleagues that are involved in that are extremely diligent and very, very systematic. So yes, we have a team. I think we now have about 38 people working at the endowment on this. This, of course, requires resources. We've been very generously supported by the Max Schmidt-Heine Foundation, and also the Swiss government actually has contributed as well. My home university, the University of St. Gallen, also contributed before we moved into a foundation status. And together we have all made this work. A very important principle, Harald, of the St. Gallen Endowment is that we remain independent of any government and any corporate influence. And we also have a very strong principle of being even-handed. So we are based in Switzerland. Switzerland has a tradition of being neutral. That's and true. we are very, very, we live very much by that credo. And as a result of building a reputation for being even-handed and systematic and professional, I think over time people have begun to trust our findings, and they've provided a useful counterpoint to some of the more official narratives which have been put out.
Yeah, that's really inspiring, and showing how non-governmental organizational projects can really support transparency, create facts, and I really appreciate this initiative. Maybe so the first questions are coming in. Before looking at them and posting them, I would have one question to start with on your data with respect to medical goods, and specifically the import and export, the import reforms, liberalizations, and the export bans. Do you have any information on those measures, whether they are here to stay, or do they include sunset clauses? Are they somehow related to the evolution of the pandemic, or what would be your assessment on this? Do you think that maybe we're coming out of this pandemic at some point with more liberalized trade in medical goods as a result?
So let's start on the import reform side. All of the import reforms that I've shown you are unilateral reforms that governments have done. And an interesting question is whether they will be reversed. Yeah. It seems that some have been reversed, but yet we seem to see that every time one is reversed, another government introduces a reform. So that the total you saw, which was above 200, has been fairly stable, and it doesn't look like that number is falling. So that provides me with a little bit of hope that we might see, more freer trade in medical goods after the pandemic is over. But there are no guarantees. Governments they can easily reverse these reforms and probably still be compliant with their WTO obligations. But again, I think the stickiness in that total that I showed you, the dark blue line at the top of the chart, which I showed you, gives me hope. Now, unfortunately, the same argument makes me a bit pessimistic about the export controls, because that, like the light brown line that I showed you, is fairly stable too. Now, we've looked into the numbers here for the discussions in the run-up to the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO, and what we've learned is that about of the 140 or so export curbs which are still in place, about 40 of them will phase out in the 6 months after the 12th Ministerial Conference, and about 100 do not have, I think it's actually 99, don't have phase-out dates. So in principle, they could go on for a very long period of time. Now, as you know, the WTO rules and the G20 pledges and other pledges made by WTO members call for temporary measures. And I have in my view, we should be recommending that temporary means temporary. So if a government puts in place a measure on export, or an export control on medical goods, they should state when it's going to end, and that end date should be no more than 6 months from the date of initiation. Now, it seems to me that you don't have to in any way alter the rights of governments to renew a measure, but we should adopt this basic principle that temporary means temporary. You have to have the phase out date. And I think that's useful to know, because it will, it concentrates minds in bureaucracies, and people will start asking the right question, which is, do we still need this export control? And if we don't, let's get rid of it. Let's go back to the trading system we had before the pandemic started. So I think we need that type of nudge to get governments to move in the right direction.
Thank you very much. So I'm looking at the Q&A, and I think I can combine two questions that are already here. So the first one, they are basically both somehow related to your statement on Canada, Japan, and Australia. So the first one would be, have you any information why Canada, Japan, and Australia refrain from introducing export restrictions? And another statement and type of questions from Martin here is that he states Canada enacted trade policy measures against Australia, presumably in response to Australia's probe into the origins of COVID in China. Which WTO steps of Australia did GTA track in response to that? Was the WTO DSU used by Australia in response? A very technical and detailed question.
All right, let's start with the first question, if I may. I must say that both Canada and Australia were very strong proponents of keeping the trading system flowing freely during the pandemic. So it doesn't surprise me that they issued, by and large, they issued export restrictions. Japan was perhaps less vocal about this, so I have less information there. But I think in the case of Canada and Australia, they aligned their actions with their rhetoric, and that was valuable. We needed leadership at that time, especially given that the even larger players were all using export control. So it was actually valuable to have some countries like Japan, Canada, and Australia who were able to stand out and say, look, we don't need these tools. But beyond that, I'm afraid I don't have much more. Now, with respect to Martin's question, I think he actually means not Canada, but China. So China enacted trade policy responses against Australia, or after Australia had the audacity to ask for an investigation into the origins of COVID. It's certainly true that China took actions which affected Australian exports, and I believe we have a number of them in the database. We're now to the second steps. Please understand the Global Trade Alert covers unilateral policy actions. So if the Australians went to the WTO to complain about Chinese actions, then this is a separate process which we don't track. And the reason we don't track it is not because we think it's unimportant. It's just that is what you can find readily on the WTO database. So you can augment our information on unilateral policy changes with the information on what the Australians have been saying and doing in Geneva to get the full picture. So that would be my recommendation there.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to add on this on this last point, you're explaining that you're just tracking unilateral trade policy in the Global Trade Initiative. In my point of view, and what we see in data, and also what we kind of try to work more on in research all over the international economics community, is basically that we see that unilateral trade policies become more and more important with respect to any type of trade policies, right? So WTO is not processing very well, not progressing in terms of reforms very well. Also, it becomes more and more difficult to have bilateral or multilateral free trade agreements. This is what the European Union can talk a lot about that, actually, in terms of proposed trade agreements and the whole ratification process and so on and so forth. And I really think that that's the main contribution, which is very, very important from these data, that we get much better information on unilateral trade policy, because that's what trade policy nowadays looks like somehow. Would you agree on that?
I strongly agree. I always felt that the balance of international trade research was skewed away from the unilateral. And I do not want to suggest that no one has ever looked at unilateral. After all, we have really nice literature on anti-dumping, which is, those decisions are all largely unilateral, unilateral exercise of rights which governments have. So I don't want to argue that there wasn't any unilateral work, but I do think the mix was really driven towards WTO and towards regional trading agreements. Whereas in fact, there's a huge amount going on at the unilateral level, which was not being studied and analyzed. Part of the problem with that, part of the reason for that, is that a lot of the unilateral action is in non-tariff measures, and we have not had particularly good information available on that, which researchers can download. And so I think one of the gaps that we are being able to fill here is by providing a lot of information on non-tariff and, by the way, tariff measures. And so analysts can really dig into this much more systematically. And for those analysts which are interested in looking at the effects of different types of trade policy, they can better estimate the different contributions. And I think this will then support a stronger set of findings which officials and policymakers can draw from.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So, of course, we have a question on the big puzzle that you already raised, and I also noted the question down on this one, so maybe I combine both. So the question from the audience, from Beatrice, is what reasons did countries introduce important restrictions on medical goods during the pandemic? So that's the puzzle you raised. And I would like to add, do you have any hints in the official government documents on why they are doing this? Because that's the big question, right?
Right. So, I mean, I argued earlier that I can't see a particularly good public health rationale for raising taxes or trade barriers or restrictions on imported medical goods. However, the argument you do hear from some governments is that they feel they have become too dependent on foreign sourcing for some of these items, and that they want to take steps to try and build up their own domestic production capacity in this area. Now, this is, for those of us in trade policy, very much old wine in new bottles. We have heard governments for decades from time to time say things like, well, we need to substitute imports with domestic production. The track record of doing this is not encouraging. And one of the debates that I think we're having now, and we will have going forward, is the extent to which governments can really assure more secure supplies of medical goods without restricting trade. So how can one do that? Now, there are, of course, options here which do not involve tariffs, such as trying to diversify the sourcing of purchases. Again, as you well know, Harald, there are no free lunches in economics. So as you diversify sourcing, this does actually add to transaction costs. And it turns out, in the analysis of shocks, it turns out the more diversified is your sourcing of goods and services, the slower is the response to a shock. So if you have a smaller number of suppliers, typically shortages last for less time. So there are, one option is diversification. It doesn't come for free. And this is, by the way, a point which I think many policymakers have not taken on board, many journalists neither. And I think people need to reflect on this, that diversification is probably, it's certainly an option you'd want to consider, but please don't think of it as a panacea. And then we also have to think about other steps that governments might take. I mean, are there some forms of medical kit that we know will be needed in any pandemic, such as personal protective equipment, masks? Are these things which we can stockpile some of? And then there are stockpiling options. Who does the stockpiling? Is it the state, or do we subsidize the private sector to do it? So there are different options there which are associated with stockpiling as well. And then I think there's another very interesting line of questioning, which is a line of inquiry. Are some medical goods items which can be produced on repurposed manufacturing platforms? So maybe you have let's take the case of the disinfectant we've had to put on our hands for the last 18 months. Some of the production lines for producing alcoholic beverages have been repurposed for producing this type of disinfectant. And so we need to, I think, go through all of the different products and see, where is a diversification solution more sensible, where is a stockpiling solution more sensible, where can we assure supply through switching of repurposing of manufacturing production facilities. And if we go through in this methodical way, I believe we will be able to come up with greater levels of assurance for policymakers and for national populations that medical kit and medical equipment will be there. And these will be, I think, options which will be a lot less costly than raising import barriers, which is the instinctive response of some governments. So I think that's the issue on the table for us at the moment. Again, it's very much an ongoing discussion.
Totally agree. Since you already mentioned diversification as one option that as policymakers you have available, and I would totally agree, nothing comes without costs. So we always have opportunity costs of doing things differently, for sure. At least in Austria, we have kind of a debate about reshoring production. What would be your stance on this as an alternative to diversification or to liberalization?
I'm quite skeptical about reshoring as a solution to concentrated sourcing, right? Let us think about how the narrative is unfolded. There were some politicians who argued that we were too dependent on sourcing medical goods from one big country. That is a polite euphemism for China, right? This is how they often frame it. And so the argument is we source too much from China, we're too dependent on China. The solution is not to make yourself too dependent on Austria, right? The solution is not to reshore production and make yourself too dependent upon production locations within Austria. Now, some people may say, well, of course, we trust Austrians better than we trust Chinese, but the pandemic doesn't differentiate between workers in Chinese factories and workers in Austrian factories, right? So I think you don't want to concentrate. If your concern is concentrated sourcing, the last thing you actually want to do is to reshore so much of it that you end up having concentrated sourcing at home, because who knows when the next pandemic hits, you may end up with a pandemic unfolding in exactly the regions of Austria where this medical goods are being produced, in which case there's no security of supply there either. So again, that's why I've always been a bit skeptical about reshoring as a solution. I must say, by the way, I think it is important to say this, that those of us who have looked into the sourcing behavior of medical goods before the pandemic, and there are many of us who have now done this, do not find that it was over concentrated in China as a general proposition. You can find some items which were more than 50% were sourced from China, but they are a very small minority of the total number of medical goods which were sourced abroad. And I think once you start putting those facts on the table, then policymakers begin to see that there's actually less need for reshoring or any of the alternatives that I described. And you may have noted that other than the Biden administration, there's a lot less talk in 2021 about over-dependence on China. And I think that is because the facts have been put on the table. And although policymakers have not taken back their previous words, I think they've realized there's no need repeating them.
Yeah, thank you. So I have two more questions. The first one is more like a clarification question. So I think it would be useful to answer this first. And then we will have a question, and I would also have a question which would go a little bit away from the medical products sector. And so maybe let's move on like this for the moment. So the first one would be the question on clarification. It's a question on the database by Yvonne. How do you treat EU countries? Do you focus on the EU trade policy only, or also take account of EU countries taking their own measures, such as export restrictions of individual EU countries at the outside of the pandemic?
So we look at the short answer to the question is we look at what the Commission does and we look at what the member states do. The slightly longer answer to say is that we actually look at whatever public bodies do, even within a country. So if if Vorarlberg decides to put in place certain public procurement measures which favor local firms, we would be interested in that too. Mm-hmm. So we're interested in supranational, national, and subnational, and we will track whatever unilateral action governments take. This decision to track in this way, I think, has proved to be very useful during the pandemic. Precisely because of the reasons that are hinted at in Yvonne's question, which is that it was the member states in the European Union, or at least rather some of them, who moved first. Okay, and the Commission very quickly had to catch up. And I think, by the way, and just for those of us, since we are in Europe, we have a bit of a weakness in the EU treaties with respect to export controls. In that the EU's treaties allow, under some circumstances, resort to export controls on public health grounds, which the member states are allowed to take. And these rights were the ones which which certain EU member states invoked. And of course, it became very clear last year that this was leading to a very unsatisfactory situation. Well, nothing short of fragmenting the single market. And as we know, I mean, one of the towering accomplishments of European integration has been to try and move towards a stronger and stronger single market. So that was clearly a step back what we saw last year, and the Commission was very well advised to move quickly to fix that problem.
Yeah, I totally agree on this. So we all in Austria remember the one case where an export of medical goods from Germany was delayed due to invoking this regulation, and then you actually had a high-level policy negotiations on whether we can have those exports in Austria from Germany, which is really, if you think about the single market, it's really a tough one to swallow somehow. So I think this is, I would agree with you on this, that there need to be some work on the European level with respect to this situation in terms of medical public health and how we deal with this within the treaties. So would totally agree. So now I would like to move on from the medical goods, at least for one or two questions. The first one is from Manfred Schickerling from the Austrian Federal Ministry of Digital and Economic Affairs, and it's about FDI. And first of all, he expresses great work, congratulations. So he's also congratulating you on the resulting database, which is really impressive. And he asks, I do understand GDA also covers measures affecting FDI. Given the status of FDI statistics, how are you assessing their effects?
So let me thank, I think it was Manfred for the question, yeah? We do indeed track policies which affect foreign direct investment. And we made a very special effort actually at the beginning of this year to do that, precisely because our 27th report, which was published in June, was all about foreign direct investment. And Manfred may want to take a look at that. You can download it off our reports page if he wants more details. Now, of course, with FDI measures, one has to look at measures which screen FDI, measures which might limit access to markets. So this is the pre-establishment rules for FDI. And then there's critically FDI post-establishment rules. So is it the case that subsidiaries of foreign multinationals are treated differently from local firms? And here, this is an important area which we track as well. So those are the three big areas that we have tracked. I would add on top of this the following, which is that please let us not forget that foreign direct investment is an option for companies, and it's a substitute for other ways of entering markets too. So the full assessment of the impact of any FDI policy, or indeed any other policy, should take account of the substitutes to FDI. So as a result, in the 27th report, you will see that we also track, what are policy changes which make FDI more attractive vis-a-vis compared to exporting, for example. And that type of trade-off, which we've well understood and is long been understood by analysts, is also reflected in the report. Now, in terms of effects of FDI, we have not done the sort of detailed econometric work on FDI policies. And it's an area which is, of course, very important. We haven't spent much time analyzing the impact of FDI policies. We've spent a lot of time documenting their existence in the first place. Anyone who wants to do that, to do an analysis of the impact of FDI policies, will probably find the list of policy interventions that we have very useful, and they, of course, could get in touch with me, and we will be happy to share what we have.
Thank you very much also for this offer to sharing the data, and that people can get directly in touch with you. I would have one last question. I'm waiting for more questions to coming in from the audience. So now we talked about FDI, and there is another thing that is very important, especially from the Austrian perspective, which is trade in services, right? So we're a tourism country. Somehow winter season is around. We're having again problems, obviously, with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so my question with respect to your data is basically, do you also have data on trade policy measures with respect to limiting or fostering trade in services? So I'm thinking about travel bans or restrictions to traveling, because that's actually what caused a lot of economic costs last winter here in Austria, that you have those travel restrictions and the winter season was gone basically. So
the short answer, Harald, to your question is yes, we do have information on policy interventions affecting the service sector. It would be, I think, fair to say that we have more information on policy interventions affecting goods, but this is, I'm afraid, standard in all of the available databases on this. I think we have collected considerably more information than anyone else in policies affecting the service sector, especially subsidy policies affecting the service sector, not just the traditional barriers that you've talked about. Now, that one normally talks about. Now, you mentioned the specific question of restrictions on people moving because of public health reasons. We have not collected that information because we took the view that these were actions taken largely on public health grounds, not on the grounds of trying to bankrupt Austria's skiing companies, right? So, Germany didn't prevent the or governments didn't prevent movement across borders for that reason. But I fully understand the collateral damage that restrictions on cross-border movements of tourists can provide, and of course that collateral damage has been witnessed here in Switzerland and the Swiss tourism sector as well. And of course, we should not forget that there are many developing countries which are highly dependent on tourism revenues in order to sustain their national income. So I think there's a very important development dimension to this matter, as well as an important European angle as well.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm looking at a Q&A section, so actually we don't have any further questions. I think I'm also very happy with all the points that I wanted to discuss here. So if there are no immediate questions are popping up, then I would like to first of all once more congratulate you on this very important and great initiative with the Global Trade Initiative, a very important project. I also encourage everybody who is interested in data on unilateral trade policies to have a deeper look at the web page, to look at the data. I think there is also a lot of empirical econometric work that can make use of these data. So I think it will be very helpful for better understanding the economic and trade effects of unilateral trade policy measures. So that's a really great point. Well, now I have one more question. So before closing again, it's Manfred. You made the point that you distinguish between measures taken for public health measures. Do you do the same for national security measures? So in other words, if the governments are saying, well, we are doing a trade policy measure due to national security, I think the US argued for a couple of things like steel, if I remember correctly. In that way, would you also then not collect those data, or would you say that's kind of trade distorting anyway?
So this is a really good question, and one which we had to think very hard about once the US changed its policy. When we set up the Global Trade Alert, we really didn't want to include foreign policy and national security concerns in there. We were going to focus on what we thought were mainly commercial policy decisions, or decisions motivated by commercial factors. Unfortunately, the Trump administration took steps which were nominally on national security grounds, but looked like they were actually on commercial grounds. And in fact, the rationale provided by the Trump administration was that economic security is national security. So once they conflated the two, then we took the view that we should report it, because some governments do not conflate national security and economic security; they keep them separate. And we would be minded not to report them. But if a government explicitly comes out and says our economic security and national security are inextricably linked, okay, or they say national security is economic security is national security, which is exactly what senior officials of the Trump administration said at the time, then I think it's incumbent upon us to report them, because these matters have been linked in the minds of the policymakers and in their statements, and so it's appropriate to report them. We also, note in our database when national security or other factors like this are invoked, so that in principle we can filter out those measures if necessary. So I think that's the long answer to your question. Our life on this was made a lot more complicated by the Trump administration, but in thinking it through, and again, this gives you a sense about how we like to work. We work from a series of 7 rules which we follow, and each case we go back to the list of rules and think through, do they apply in a particular case, or do the rules need to be elaborated given a set of circumstances that we had not anticipated. And I think that's an important lesson that we have learned over the last 12 years, is that you can write a set of principles for how you want to collect information, but the real world is often messy, and it forces you to think hard about what those rules mean and whether or not they need to be restated or clarified. And the Trump national security / economic security tariffs were a leading example of that process.
Yeah, Manfred has something to add on this, which is related and comes back to the FDI story. So he says, for example, regarding investment screening based on NS in the US and the EU, and based on national interest test in Canada and Australia. So I think he would like to have some clarification on whether this national interest test in Canada, Australia would also mean that you're not looking at it because they say it's national interest. But I assume that you would call that a commercial policy act anyway, right?
I mean, this, I would say that yes, and that, I mean, we can go into specific examples, but when you look at the totality of the regime, then I think you see that there are clear commercial dimensions to it. That is not to say that every single provision has a commercial dimension. So there may well be a national security element or a national security argument. Just the presence of one such argument would not mean that we would exclude it from our monitoring, but we would want to look at the entire regime and see if there are commercial policy components, and if there are, we would be, I think, minded to include it. Again, I think a lot has to do with how the regime is put together and also how it's executed, right? So if an FDI screening mechanism is executed in a way where only the national security officials make the determinations and they are accountable for that, and there's transparency that this is being done on a national security basis, then I think I would think very differently about that than a FDI screening mechanism where there is a combination of economic as well as national security officials making the decision. I would think even more skeptically about it if the chair of the decision making was an economic official, not a national security official. So you can see there's elements here in not just the statement of the law, but how it's executed or the institutional structure that goes with it, which help you tease out whether or not there's a commercial dimension to this. Again, I think that's what I'm doing here is hopefully giving you and your colleague a sense of how we think about analyzing these problems, or these challenges, or documenting these policy interventions. And of course, the last thing is that if people feel like we shouldn't have them in there, then the easy thing to do is when you get our data, filter them out when you're doing your own analysis. I mean, I think that's one way of thinking about it. At the beginning of the Global Trade Alert, there were some people who very strongly said we should not include information on anti-dumping, anti-subsidy, and safeguard actions. And our view, we thought very hard about this, and we argued that excluding them is highly contested. It's not as if it's not a consensus position amongst trade policy analysts, and that the right thing to do would be to include this information in the database, but to report statistics with and without those measures, and to allow people to filter them out if they used our database. We thought that was a way of meeting all of the different user needs, bearing in mind that the users didn't agree on whether or not those measures should be in or not. So I think, again, I'm hoping that we're giving you a sense about how we've tried to approach this in a deliberate and thoughtful manner.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think this last example nicely documents how much work it actually is to, first of all, even decide on whether to include some measures in your data. And so it again shows how much effort is going into this project. So thank you very much for this. Now we're running out of time, so I would like to stop here. Before concluding, first of all, I would just like to announce that we already have a date for our next Trade Talks seminar series. We will have our next FIW-Trade Talks with Gabriel Felbermayr from the Austrian Institute of Economic Research on December 7th at 4 p.m. And the topic will be about chaos in global value chains, so also very timely and recent topic that we want to discuss. I think we're gonna make this one in German then, so because we are all in Austria then. And with this, I would once more really want to thank you, Simon, for being with us today. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much for all your insights on the Global Trade Initiative and your specific expertise on trade policy measures with specific focus on COVID-19 and medical goods trade. I hope everyone enjoyed this talk as much as I did. Now it's 12 o'clock, so for the audience, enjoy your lunch break. Simon, thanks once more for being with us today. And everybody stay healthy, and hope to see you soon in real life again. Thanks very much, and bye.
Thank you, Harald. Excellent. Thank you.
Bye.